From Washington, NPACT continues its coverage of hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Here again, correspondent Jim Lehrer.
As the hearings resumed after the luncheon break, the new witness is Robert Reisner, a former aide to Jeb Magruder, Deputy Director of the Committee to Re-elect the President.
The committee will come to order. Greg's all right to start with. Okay. Council will call the next witness.
Will Mr. Robert Reisner take the witness chair, please?
Yeah. I'm so scared I'll whisper something. Yeah. You stand up, hold up your right hand. You swear that the evidence that you shall give to the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Terry Lenzner, Assistant Chief Counsel, will ask the first few questions of the witness.
Mr. Reisner, will you spell your name and address, please?
My name's Robert Reisner, middle initial AF. My address is 2727 29th Street in Northwest Washington.
And could you spell your last name, please?
It's Reisner.
And you're appearing here today without counsel, is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you have any short opening statement you'd like to make?
No, I don't. As you know, Mr. Lenzner, Mr. Chairman, I've met with your staff on a number of occasions in an effort to try to be as cooperative as I could be, and I'm appearing here in the same spirit, and I'll be glad to answer your questions as fully as possible.
And I'd like to say on behalf of the committee, the staff assures me that you have been most cooperative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Reisner, could you pull the microphone closer to your mouth, please? Mr. Reisner, were you employed by the committee to re-elect the President in November of 1971?
I was.
And what was your position with the committee?
I was administrative assistant to Mr. Jeb Magruder.
And how long did you hold that position?
I worked for Mr. Magruder from November 1971 until July 1972. In July, I then went to work for Mr. Clark McGregor as his executive assistant.
And when did you leave the committee to re-elect?
On November 8th, following the election.
Now, can you briefly describe your duties as Mr. Magruder's administrative assistant?
My duties were pretty conventionally that of an administrative assistant. There were three kinds of duties, basically. I was responsible for the people, for coordinating among the people that he saw, in other words, his schedule. I was responsible for coordinating the paper flow that came in and out of his office, and therefore the decisions, just keeping track of the decisions that accompanied that paper flow. And finally, I was responsible for sort of a follow-up role, just keeping tabs on things that he wanted to have done and that he had asked various senior staff members to do for him.
Now, in those duties, did you maintain a diary of Mr. Magruder's schedule?
No, I did not personally maintain a diary. I was responsible for his calendar, and I had a secretary who also worked directly for Mr. Magruder named Vicki Shern, and her role was to keep a calendar and to keep his own calendar up to date, and that would be the accurate record of his schedule.
Now, did there come a time when you were introduced to Gordon Liddy?
Yes, I was.
And when was that, and who introduced you?
Well, I met Mr. Liddy, I imagine the first time, sometime around the beginning of the time that he came to the committee. I believe that would have been in December of 1971.
And who introduced you to him?
Well, Mr. Magruder introduced me to him in the sense of a formal introduction. I suppose I perhaps met Mr. Liddy the first time at a staff meeting in December of 1971.
And what did Mr. Magruder say at that staff meeting about Mr. Liddy's activities?
Well, Mr. Magruder indicated at that time that Mr. Liddy was going to become general counsel of the Committee for the Re-election of the President. And in addition to that, he made a joke about the fact that Mr. Liddy would also be involved in some research activities.
He described those research activities in any other detail?
Yes, he was making a joke about it, and I think that he may have said something to the effect of Mr. Liddy is also has other talents. I think there was some phrase similar to super sleuth or something to that effect. The reason I remember that is subsequently I was told by another member of the staff that Mr. Liddy was rather upset about that reference.
Now, I'm going to show you, Mr. Reisner, some documents and ask you if you can identify these, which are copies of materials you previously turned over to the committee pursuant to a subpoena ducus tecum.
Yes, the documents that you've just given me are Xerox copies of a log which I maintain myself. Beginning in January of 1972, I began to keep a notebook which was basically a calendar notebook, but I didn't use it as an accurate recording of meetings or dates. I used it just for my own personal use to keep track of things in chronological order.
Including Mr. Magruder's, some of Mr. Magruder's appointments?
That's right. My entire job was related between November of 1971 and July of 1972. My job was related to his activities. And as a result, it was that keyed to my own activities, and I recorded what was going on.
Now, would you look at the first entry on January 27, 1972? Mm-hmm. Does that reflect a meeting at approximately 11 o'clock with several individuals, including Mr. Magruder?
Yes. What it says here is at 11 o'clock it says Jeb, John Dean, Gordon Liddy, and then there's at White House, there's a notation indicating that.
And the next document, the next page, does that reflect a meeting on February the 4th at approximately 4 o'clock?
It's on the third page. It says meeting with AG with Liddy. What that would have indicated, incidentally, is it would have simply indicated that Mr. Magruder had a meeting in the Attorney General's office, and that it was the intention at the time that this notation was made that Mr. Liddy would accompany Mr. Magruder to that meeting. This does not record the fact that such a meeting would have taken place.
Now, for the same date, February 4th, is there also an indication that reads file folders ready for AG?
Yes, it does, at 2 o'clock.
Could you explain what that means?
The nature of Mr. Magruder's, the way in which he prepared himself to go to meetings with Mr. Mitchell, both during the time that he was Attorney General and subsequently, was that he had two large gray file folders. One of them contained documents that Mr. Magruder wished to bring up with Mr. Mitchell. The other contained Xerox copies, identical Xerox copies of those documents, and for Mr. Magruder's convenience, so that if he handed Mr. Mitchell a copy of a document, he would himself have a copy to refer to. And that's what this refers to. It means that those two folders were prepared with the documents that he wanted to take to the meeting with him.
Now, prior to the meeting with Mr. Mitchell, did Mr. Liddy ask you to obtain anything for him in preparation for that meeting?
I'm not certain whether this was the meeting. I don't remember Mr. Liddy going to meetings with Mr. Mitchell very often. I presume this was the meeting. I can remember a conversation with Mr. Liddy in which he came to me and indicated that he had something of the nature of a visual presentation that he wished to make, and he was interested in being certain that there was an easel or something that he could mount this on in Mr. Mitchell's office. I subsequently tried to determine whether there was such a assistance. I don't think I did it myself. I think I asked one of the secretaries to call Mr. Mitchell's secretary to make that determination, and there was none. That was the nature of the conversation and his inquiry.
Now, did you ever see Mr. Liddy with any charts or packages?
I saw him with a package that I think might have been charts and might not have been charts. I can't say.
Do you remember approximately when that was?
I relate it to approximately the same period of time.
Now, do you know if anybody else attended this meeting on February 4th or was scheduled to attend it?
Well,
besides Mr. Liddy and Mr. Mitchell, Mr. Magruder?
I don't know. I have been shown the records that were kept by the secretary who worked for me, Vicki Shern, and in those records it indicates that Mr. Dean would have been invited to attend that meeting too. That's what the records show. I have no recollection myself.
Now, in February or March of 1972, did Mr. Liddy furnish you with a document to give to Mr. Magruder?
Well, I think that we've discussed a document which Mr. Liddy gave to me. He, from time to time, would come into my office, which was located in front of Mr. Magruder's office. It was adjacent. And when Mr. Liddy was unable to get in to see Mr. Magruder, because he was busy or for other reasons, or perhaps he just hadn't scheduled an appointment, he would, from time to time, stop in my office, indicate the nature of his business. He, from time to time, did stop in, and on one occasion I can remember him giving me a sheet of paper, which I would identify only as being a blank sheet of paper with some typing on it. I don't remember a letterhead. On this sheet of paper, the only recollection I have of the sheet of paper that we've discussed is that there were some figures in the right-hand side of the page. Mr. Liddy made the statement to me that he hated to write something like this down, and that's literally the extent of the statement. It was clear to me that I shouldn't, that it wasn't for my consumption either, because of the way in which he gave me the piece of paper. And as he handed it to me, it was put face down on the desk, and I would say within a matter of minutes, given to Mr. Magruder. And that's...
Do you remember if there was a total on that paper, total amount?
Well, we've discussed this. My best recollection is that there could have been a total, and that I seem to remember the figure 250. Subsequently, I've read newspaper accounts indicating that there was $250,000 in a certain alleged budget. It's supposition on my part to say what that piece of paper was. I don't know.
Now, did Mr. Magruder go to Florida in late March 1972?
In late March 1972, yes, he did.
And is that reflected in the documents in front of you, that trip, for March 29th, 30th, and 31st?
Circled here. Yes. On the 29th, there's a entry saying Jeb leaving from Miami.
Do you know who he was going to see?
Yes. At that time, it's my recollection that Mr. Mitchell was at Key Biscayne, and that Jeb had a meeting with Mr. Mitchell in Key Biscayne, and that's who he was going to see.
And are there any notations reflecting Mr. Liddy's name on any of those dates in your documents?
Okay. I think what you're referring to is well, it says leave for Key Biscayne also on the 29th. On the 30th, well, there are a number of references to Mr. Liddy.
Well, in the upper left-hand corner of the 30th, what does that reflect?
Okay, it says get Gordon Liddy.
And what does that represent?
Well, it says that column, I believe, would have referred to the fact that I'd been asked to get Gordon Liddy. My best recollection of this is that the reason I was asked to get Gordon Liddy was I was asked to reach him and have him call Mr. Magruder. That's just a vague recollection. It could have come at another time, but it makes sense in conjunction with this entry.
And that's an entry in your handwriting, is that correct?
That's right. Mr. Magruder was not in Washington at the time, as is indicated here also, and I think that was the reason for being asked to get Mr. Liddy to call him.
Now, there's an entry on March 31st in the upper right-hand corner of Mr. Liddy's name.
It says, Gordon Liddy, give answer.
What does that represent?
Well, the nature of this diary is that, or not diary, nature of this log is a recording of activity that's taking place in the office. It's just a random recording of interruptions. It appears from the way in which this appears that Mr. Liddy would have interrupted me and said that he needed an answer. I don't know whether that represented a phone call or Mr. Liddy simply stopping by the office. This illustrates the purpose for keeping the log in the first place. There were lots of interruptions like that and a lot of activity, and that was the reason for writing it down, just to remember it.
Now, after Mr. Magruder returned from Florida, did he give you a message or instructions to pass on to Mr. Liddy?
No, I'm not certain that it was when he returned from Florida. What I remember was that I do remember on one occasion, the timing of the occasion roughly coincides with this. Mr. Magruder standing in my doorway and telling me to call Mr. Liddy. Now, it was his habit to frequently do that. That was the nature of my job. He would come and give me numerous instructions, and I was to pass on approvals, disapprovals, that sort of thing, reactions to decisions or matters that he was handling. He appeared in my doorway and said, call Liddy, tell him it's approved, or tell him it's approved and that we need to get going in the next 2 weeks. That was a perfectly characteristic thing for him to say, because I frequently called other senior members in the committee and told them similar things. I made such a phone call. I relate it roughly in time to this because I have the feeling that the first week or two in April had something to do with the 2 weeks. That's a very vague recollection. I called Mr. Liddy, and his reaction was a little bit different than the reaction of most people that I communicated this kind of decision to, and I remember it. He said, but I can't, it's going to be hard, or something like that. And he protested. And I indicated to him that he was going to have to talk to Mr. Magruder about it, that I didn't know what it was that I was telling him about, that whatever he had talked about with Mr. Magruder was approved. And if that made sense to him, then I was glad to pass it on to him. He said he subsequently did talk to Mr. Magruder on a number of occasions. I assume that whatever the matter was resolved.
I'm going to show you, Mr. Reisner, now some documents which have previously been used here, and ask you if there came a time in June of 1972 when you observed those documents in the possession of Mr. Magruder.
These documents were shown to me by you and other members of the staff. They seem to me to be similar to documents that I observed. That I remember on two occasions seeing something similar to the envelope. I remember seeing something similar to the material, to this letterhead. I believe I tried to describe this on one earlier occasion, and that was I appeared before the grand jury and was asked about the nature of observing documents similar to this. At that time, I identified documents which are not exactly like this. Upon seeing them on a subsequent occasion, I think probably these are the documents. I mean, I think that this is the stationery.
You say that the documents you saw at the grand jury are not...
No. I did not. I've never been shown documents by Mr. Silbert or his staff. He indicated that he might at some future time do that. I don't think has had an opportunity to do that. But at the time, I was asked to try to identify what I saw. And when I did so, I identified it slightly differently than this. But upon seeing this, I think this is the same document.
Now,
I'm just trying to be accurate on that.
Now, approximately when did you see these documents, and describe the circumstances surrounding your observations?
During the week prior to June 17th, and perhaps it was during the 2 weeks prior to June 17th. I can't be certain on exactly the time. I observed documents similar to this here.
You're referring to the stationery?
I'm referring to the stationery with gemstone at the top.
Have those stationery marked or identification. Oh, they already been marked.
I think they're 18. I'm not positive.
Yeah, it's Exhibit 16 for ID. On that occasion, it was simply in Mr. Magruder's hands or lying on his desk. I'm not certain. Subsequently, I was handed the document And I was handed it in such a way that it was indicated to me very clearly that it was not for me to observe, that it was not for my consumption. At that time, it was handed to me, and I had, that was the second time that I saw it, and it was during those 2 weeks prior to the 17th.
Now, that was Mr. Magruder who handed them to you in his office, is that correct?
Yes, he did.
And did he hand you what appeared to be the stationery and the envelope together?
My memory of the envelope is that it was slit open, and that the stationery was either in it, slit open, or on top of it, and that they were together.
And what was his instructions? What were you supposed to do with these materials?
Okay, at that time I was doing the activity that I just described a few minutes ago. I was preparing Mr. Mitchell's files for a meeting with Mr. Mitchell. Now, he was campaign director at this time, and it was a daily activity.
Well, you were told...
I was handed the documents, and I was asked to put them in Mr. Mitchell's file. The nature of that is that things that Mr. Magruder might have wished to take up with Mr. Mitchell were put in the file marked Mr. Mitchell's file, and that's all. That doesn't indicate any more than that.
And is it accurate also that you saw these on a third occasion in Mr. Magruder's drawer?
Yes, it is.
Now, on either of those occasions, were there also photographs with the stationery and the envelope?
There appeared, well, I'm not certain whether the photographs were with the stationery on the occasion I described, in which I was handed them and told, I don't know whether I was told not to, I mean, it was clear that it was not for me to be looking at them. I do remember photographs, or what appeared to be photographs, with the stationery on that third occasion.
Now, I want to direct your attention to June the 17th. On the evening of June the 17th, did you receive a call from Mr. Magruder at home?
Yes, I did. I received a call at approximately 6 o'clock. I was asleep at the time.
And did he instruct you to go to the office?
Yeah, the nature of his instruction was, and the conversation, as I remember it, was, Robert, we have some things that we would like you to get from the office and to remove from it. And I think the nature of his description was that we have some sensitive material that we want you to remove from the office. He then went on and said, and Bob, there's a file there. It has, Mr. Magruder spoke on this occasion, and I think on other occasions, in a generalized way. That I don't remember complete sentences. It was, Bob, we have some things there. There's a file. It has gemstone in it, or it has some papers called gemstone in it. You know what I mean? And I said, well, I think so. He said, it's in a blue file. And I said, I think I know where it is. And he also said, and there's sensitive things in the office, and we'd like you to take them out and just keep them over the weekend.
Did you go down to the office after you received that phone call?
I did.
And did you go to Mr. Magruder's office?
I did.
And did you see Mr. Odle there?
Yes, I did. When I went into the office, Mr. Odle was there with a number of other people watching the evening news.
And did you thereafter have a conversation telephonically between yourself, Mr. Odle, and Mr. Magruder?
Yes, I did. It was after the news was over, or certainly after the portion of the news in which the break-in which had occurred was discussed. The other people left the room, and Mr. Odle suggested that we call Mr. Magruder.
And would you just briefly describe what Mr. Magruder said to you and Mr. Odle?
Yeah, the first, I think the purpose of the call and the first discussion in the call was Mr. Odle wanted to describe what we'd just seen on the news and what the coverage was at that point. He went on to that, from that, and I think discussed in general security matters at the committee. It was my impression that he had previously talked to Mr. Magruder that day about security at the committee. He then went on and said, now, Jeb, I understand that I was on the other phone at this point, which was not the one at Mr. Magruder's desk. He said, Jeb, now, there are these things that you've asked Bob to get out of the office. The reason he knew that was that when I walked into the office, I sat down at Mr. Magruder's desk and removed several things from his desk. I removed a polling file, and I removed what appeared to me to be one of the more important things in the file, which was the analysis of the polls. And I'd removed the operating plans, which described the key states and our strategy following the phone call, and felt that the activity was perhaps a little bit foolish to be sitting at his desk removing things. So I stopped, and subsequently the phone call took place. At that point, Mr. Odle brought up the fact that there were some things that I had already taken from the desk, and he wished to know from Mr. Magruder what else there was that we should remove. And he, at that point, was volunteering to be of assistance. I think there was some concern at that time for just the security of these documents. The senior campaign officials were in California, and I think there was some concern at that moment that they be in control of things.
Well, Mr. Reisner, could you describe what Mr. Magruder's instructions were?
Mr. Magruder's instructions then became very specific concerning a blue file folder. I knew what he was talking about at that point. I think it was at that point that I knew specifically what he was talking about. And he indicated that that was one of the things that had to be removed.
Did he say on the phone the word gemstone on that occasion?
It is not my specific recollection that he did. He could have. He definitely identified specifically a file folder. It seems to me he said it in the first phone conversation. He may or may not have in the second phone conversation.
Well, did you later obtain the blue folder?
Yes. At that point, I didn't know where the folder was. I think I indicated that to him. But I said that I knew where it was, that I could find it. At that point, Mr. Odle was volunteering to be of assistance, and Mr. Magruder changed his instruction and indicated to me that Mr. Odle should take home that, and he then generalized it and said, and other, contender materials or other strategy materials or something to that effect. Mr. Odle then, the conversation terminated shortly after that. Mr. Odle left, and I was left the task of finding it, which I did.
You found it, and what did you do with it?
Well, I believe that what I did with it was I combined it with some other materials, the other materials concerning contenders, and that I put those materials in Mr. Odle's office in his briefcase, and I locked his briefcase. Mr. Odle had at that point gone down to the third floor, and I went down there to indicate to him that these things were in his briefcase.
Okay. One last question. You were subpoenaed by this committee on or about March 30th of this year, is that correct?
That's correct.
Prior to that time, had you been interviewed by either the U.S. Attorney or the FBI?
No, and I had not been interviewed by anyone, the Democratic National Committee in their civil suit, the FBI, or the U.S. Attorney.
That's all the questions I have, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, should we read for the record what's on this?
Yes, I would suggest to have this marked. He identified, as I understand, to being similar to the papers folder he'd seen there in the office.
For the record, this envelope is Exhibit 18 for identification. In capital letters are indicated sensitive material. In smaller letters, handle as code word material. And in the lower left-hand corner, the words exdis, and under that, no dissem, D-I-S-E-M. And Exhibit 16 for identification has a blue border around it, capital letters, gemstone, date, and source. Exhibit 2 of 16 has the same printing, except in the lower left-hand corner it says exdis, no dissem, and in the bottom it says, warning, this information is for intelligence purposes only. Exploitation may compromise source and terminate flow of information. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Reisner, when did you first become aware of the fact that Mr. Liddy was engaged in intelligence gathering activities?
I think probably there was a general awareness on my part that he was obtaining information about the time that he came to the committee. At the time of the introduction that I described, When it was made known to me that Mr. Liddy had not wished to be described that way, I think I assumed an awareness at that point.
That was in December of
That's correct.
1971?
Yes, sir.
You were described as a super sleuth or super spy, something like that?
It was a joking reference.
It turned out to be incorrect, too, didn't it?
It turned out to be correct.
Was there any discussion back and forth among the other people who were in that particular meeting as to exactly what Mr. Liddy's role was, or why he might be referred to that?
I don't remember any discussion. It came as a surprise to me that Mr. Liddy was concerned about having been referred to in that manner.
What did you think about Mr. Liddy, personally? What was your evaluation of him as to his stability or the kind of man that he was, considering the important position that he had?
I've discussed this with your staff. I think that my impression of Mr. Liddy was that he may have been a very capable legal general counsel, but that he also occasionally did some fairly bizarre things. He gave...
we know of one.
Pardon?
For example?
He gave a secretary in our office a large poster of himself. Probably,
I don't know if we should pursue that any further, but...
Probably 6 feet by 4 feet in size.
Larger than life size.
Larger than life.
What kind of picture was it?
I believe it was a picture of himself with a bullhorn, and he may have had a gun in his hand, conducting a raid of some kind. He was in front of a police car. There was another poster, as a matter of fact. I think of him. I have the impression of him next to an airplane or something like that, but it was occasionally bizarre. Next to an airplane. The other thing is that his relationship with my superior at that time, Mr. Magruder, was less than friendly on all occasions. And I think that from that I had an impression of him that he was certainly not an easy employee to have around. I think I indicated that to Mr. Magruder on one occasion, and he agreed.
Do you seem to have any particular friends at the committee? You mentioned trouble that he had with Magruder. We've heard other testimony that he had trouble with Magruder. Personal differences.
Well, I'm not certain. I think that when Mr. Liddy, I think the reason for the trouble with Mr. Magruder was that it may have been that he didn't like to work for a younger man. I can remember on one occasion after he had gone to work for the finance division, just seeing him in the hallway or something and saying to him, "How are you doing?" And he went into a long explanation of his great respect for Mr. Stans and for Mr. Stans as a manager and that sort of thing. And I think that he may very well have had a number of friends at the committee. I didn't know Mr. Liddy very well at all, and I saw him around. He seemed to be friendly with people at the committee.
Were you aware of any sums of cash that Mr. Liddy was receiving for his activities?
I was aware, in one sense, that I was aware that Mr. Porter had some cash in his possession that was contained in a safe in his office, and that he indicated to me that he had made disbursements to Mr. Liddy.
What do you know about the cash that Porter kept in his office?
Well, I know that...
First of all, again, who was Porter, and what was his position?
Mr. Porter, who was the Director of Scheduling and Surrogate Activity in the committee, had a safe in his office in which he kept the petty cash for the committee. Prior to April 7th, Mr. Porter came to me and asked me to assist him in just totaling up the disbursements and receipts related to that safe. Since the purpose of my doing that was to be able to report to my boss, Mr. Magruder, for whom Mr. Porter also worked, that there wasn't any pocketing of cash or anything like that, that there was an account, that there was a system.
Did you
and
assist?
I did that.
assist him in totaling the cash?
I did, and it was on that occasion that I learned that Mr. Liddy was receiving some sums of cash from Mr. Porter.
Were there also receipts there for cash that had been dispersed?
There weren't exactly receipts. There were white slips of paper on which the initials of the individual to whom Mr. Porter had given cash were recorded, and Mr. Liddy made a mark on those white slips of paper.
What was the total amount, if you recall, of the cash plus the receipts, the cash that had been dispersed?
Well, the total amount, when you added up the amount that Mr. Porter had received, seems to me to be in the range of $40,000 to $50,000. But
is that what the committee was referring to as petty cash at that time?
Well, I referred to it as petty cash until I had assisted Mr. Porter in the activity.
You realized it was greater than you had thought?
I'm sorry?
And you realized the money he had was more than you originally thought?
With this exception. It was not petty cash in the sense that there was $7,000 or $8,000 on hand, which is certainly not petty cash. The $40,000 to $50,000 that I'm referring to is sums that had accrued from the beginning of the time that there were receipts, July or June of 1971.
How much cash?
Until March.
How much cash was in the safe?
How much cash at that time? It seems to me that it was in the neighborhood of several $1,000s, perhaps as much as $5,000 or $6,000.
All right. Did the receipts, do you recall any names, any amounts of individuals who were receiving money from Mr. Porter's safe?
Well, I can remember that there were, in addition to Mr. Liddy. Now, Mr. Liddy, it was Mr. Porter that indicated to me that Mr. Liddy was receiving money. There was an individual who was referred to by a code name, and that code name was Sedan Chair, and that individual had
Sedan Chair?
Yes, I
two
believe
words?
It was Sedan Chair 2.
Sedan Chair 2?
Yes.
Was there a Sedan Chair 1?
I don't know. I don't know. Perhaps there was. There was also an individual who worked for Mr. Porter named Roger Stone, who I believe received money. And there may have been other individuals, but to my recollection, which is a little bit vague on this, there wasn't a regular disbursement with those exceptions.
And who was Sedan Chair?
I don't know. I know that, well, I mean, I have a sort of a general circumstantial understanding of who I think Sedan Chair was. I'll come as close as I can.
Tell us about it.
Subsequently to that, after I'd learned that there was such an individual, I think I was more alert to the name. And I did see a memo in April, I believe, or perhaps May, that purported to be a report from another campaign committee. I believe it was the Humphrey Committee. I don't know for a fact who Sedan Chair was. It could have been someone who just simply had his disagreements with the Humphrey Committee and wished to report on some of their activities.
But it was someone in the Humphrey Committee, from what you could tell.
From what I can tell, and I mean, it purported to be. I don't know.
How much money was he? How much money was this individual receiving, according to what you?
My recollection is that it was approximately $1,000 a month, but I could have read that in the newspaper. Frankly, it's vague.
What about Mr. Liddy?
Mr. Liddy received several disbursements that were considerably larger than that. I think they were in the neighborhood of $5,000 to $8,000. I'm not certain. The reason I remember them is that he would return sums of money, and it made the accounting somewhat bizarre. He would return $300 after taking out $8,000, that sort of thing. I really am not completely clear on that.
Was there any indication as to the total amount Liddy had received up
No,
till that time?
No, there wasn't. I have the feeling that the total magnitude in $40,000 to $50,000 means that, and that's the total magnitude of what was recorded. I have no idea whether, I mean, Mr. Porter, I don't think would have hidden any of what he was recording, but I mean, I only saw what the receipts were there, and Mr. Liddy's total figure, I would think, would be in the nature of half of that.
Did you state when this inventory took place?
In March. Late March.
March of '72.
I could pin it down exactly, but it was late March.
From the money in Mr. Porter's safe, could you tell either from anything that you saw in there in the nature of receipts from conversations with Mr. Porter, from conversations with anyone else about any other operations or individuals who were being funded, who had been paid money out of the safe of Mr. Porter?
No, anything else would be by nature of supposition. There's nothing else that's...
Do you know...
that's hard.
Or have any basis for believing that any demonstrations or counter-demonstrations were funded from...
Yes, there was one occasion in April in which I overheard a conversation. The nature of my job was such that there are pieces of these things that were overheard that after subsequent events they perhaps take some meaning. I was sitting in Mr. Magruder's office at the time that he received a phone call. The phone call concerned the fact that there was a desire to get some counter-demonstrators or demonstrators to attend the Hoover funeral, that there was some sort of a planned demonstration there. It seems to me that was an activity that Mr. Liddy was then asked to undertake, and it seems to me that there was some cash in that activity.
Magruder asked Liddy to take care of that?
When I say this, I say this in an effort to be cooperative, because I'm talking about only my specific recollection. It may be that wasn't carried out, or that it was carried out differently from the way in which I heard it in that conversation, and I think only Mr. Porter could be of assistance there, but that was the nature of the initial conversation.
Did you have occasion to overhear a conversation between Mr. Magruder and Mr. Porter concerning a possible front for some of Mr. Porter's activities?
Yes, I did.
Would you tell us about that?
That was earlier. That was in either January or February or perhaps December. And it was, again, it was the same, the nature of the conversation was identical. It was the beginning of a discussion that didn't take place with me present. And in the beginning of that discussion, Mr. Magruder indicated to Mr. Porter that Mr. Kalmbach had agreed to find a job for someone who was going to work for Mr. Porter. That was the nature of the conversation.
Did you state what kind of work?
No, the idea was that there was a business concern who was going to employ an individual who would work for Mr. Porter. That was the limit of the conversation that I heard. I think inferentially, and from the circumstances under which the conversation took place, it was my feeling that that was by way of a front activity. But as to whether it was, in fact, as to whether it was carried out, as to whether Mr. Kalmbach was of assistance, I can't help with that.
What did you think Porter was doing?
I'm not certain. I think that what I thought he was perhaps doing was obtaining information, that there was possibly people that were working for him who were perhaps disgruntled with other campaigns, or perhaps just individuals who wanted to be involved in politics and who wanted to obtain information and pass it into the into our campaign. That was really as close as I could come.
Right. You never asked him.
Well, there were one or two occasions on which I was present in the office and I was shown something. For example, one time I was shown a Xerox copy of what purported to be minutes of an issues group that Senator Muskie had. Now, I don't know whether those in fact were minutes of any real issues group. I mean,
who showed you that?
I believe it was Mr. Porter was giving it to Mr. Magruder. It wasn't by way of showing it to me.
You don't know how you obtained...
No, I don't. I don't have any idea. It could easily have been that there was somebody working for Senator Muskie who had decided that they wished to do that. It could also, I mean, you can make other assumptions which are more negative concerning that.
When did you first become aware that the gemstone file had to do with surveillance activities of some kind?
I'm not certain. I don't think that I am necessarily aware at this time I think that when I lock it in with Mrs. Harmony's testimony and with other witnesses, it seems to me that I have a pretty good idea of what it was.
Didn't the Monday following The Monday following the break-in, the Democratic National Committee, the Watergate, didn't you shred a file yourself?
Yes, I did. The nature of that was, I think in just to understand why the idea of shredding a file would go through my mind, I think you have to go into the nature of why files were shredded. There was a tremendous amount of paper in our committee. Part of my responsibility in giving Mr. Mitchell documents, was to make 5 copies of each document that went to the campaign director.
I regret to say there's a signal for a vote in the Senate, and so I guess we'd better get over there and come back as quick as we can.
Okay.
As the senators take a recess to vote on a bill dealing with the energy crisis, they have more information about a cash fund to mull over. The money was in the safe of Herbert Porter, and much of it went to G. Gordon Liddy. Minority Counsel Fred Thompson will continue his questioning of Robert Reisner, an aide to Jeb Magruder, in a moment. Right now, we would like to thank you, the viewers, for your comments on this gavel-to-gavel coverage. Your response has been overwhelming. To date, we've received more than 69,000 cards and letters, and we're very grateful to those of you who've taken the trouble to write us. If any of you still want to express an opinion, we suggest you do it to your local public television station. In our public television system, it's each local station, your local station, which makes the individual decision on whether to carry programming like this. So if you have an attitude about your local station's decision, why don't you express it to them, and we're sure they'll appreciate it. Public television's coverage of these hearings will continue after this pause for station identification.
Unabridged coverage of these hearings is provided as a public service by the member stations of PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service. From Washington, NPACT continues its coverage of hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Here again, correspondent Robert McNeil.
So the members of the committee came back in after their vote in the Senate on the energy crisis bill, in which they approved by 85 votes to 10 a legal requirement on big oil companies for mandatory allocations of oil to smaller companies. Back at the hearings at this point, Fred Thompson has another question for Robert Reisner.
Thompson has finished his examination or not?
Chairman, I just have one other question. I've already exceeded my time, and I apologize, but I do have one question. If I remember Mrs. Harmony's testimony correctly, she referred to a belief, I believe, of the committee that there were possibly plants inside the committee to re-elect. Did you have any knowledge or belief, or was there any opinion as to that fact?
No, I did not. I know that there was a great deal of effort expended on finding such plants, and we never found any.
Why was there a belief that there were such plants?
There were a number of occasions in which articles appeared in the newspaper, which I think would have lent to great suspicion that there was material being fed out of our committee into the newspapers and possibly to other candidates. There was such a wire story in the week prior to June 17th, according to my best recollection. And there were such occasions. Mr. Anderson, Jack Anderson, had on several occasions had information that seemed that it could only have come from inside our committee.
Printing of internal committee documents?
I don't believe that there were any documents themselves, but I do
references to what?
To information and to activity and to that sort of thing, which was going on in our committee, which I think could only have gotten into the newspaper if someone had been feeding it out of our committee. There was just a feeling like that.
Thank you, Mr. Reisner. That's all.
You state that you kept a log. Exactly what was that?
Exactly what was the log? My log was a sort of a daily just reporting of activity that was going on. I would be interrupted frequently, and I might make a notation that someone had come to me.
Now, as I understand, you reported that your log shows that prior to February the 4th, that there was a meeting at the White House attended by Magruder, Liddy, and Dean.
Yes, sir.
Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
And then your log shows that on February the 4th, there was a meeting of Liddy, John Mitchell, Jeb Stuart Magruder, and John W. Dean III.
Mr. Chairman, yes, in the other notebook that was kept by Vicki Shern, that Mr. Dean's name appears. It doesn't appear in my notebook.
Yes. Where did this meeting on February the 4th take place?
The disagreement?
No. Where did it take place?
That meeting would have taken place in Mr. Mitchell's office at the Justice Department.
At the Justice Department?
Yes, sir.
Then
I believe.
You stated that in March that Mr. Magruder went to Key Biscayne in Florida.
Yes, sir.
For the purpose of meeting with Mr. Mitchell.
Yes, sir.
And when Mr. Magruder, after he came back from Key Biscayne, that Mr. Magruder told you to call Liddy and tell Liddy that it was arranged.
Mr. Chairman, to be precise, my recollection is that on one occasion I was asked to call Mr. Liddy and to make such a statement. My recollection is that it could have occurred shortly after that trip because the time seems correct.
Yeah.
I can't be absolutely certain.
To whom did Magruder report at the committee to re-elect the president?
Mr. Magruder worked for Mr. Mitchell.
Did Mr. Magruder send many memoranda to Mr. Mitchell?
Yes, sir, he did. And he also, memoranda that would have been prepared by senior staff members at the committee would have been sent through Mr. Magruder to Mr. Mitchell.
Yes. Now, how frequently did Mr. Magruder send memoranda to Mr. Mitchell?
Mr. Magruder, it would have been unlikely to have met with Mr. Mitchell if he didn't have some matters worthy of Mr. Mitchell's attention. He met with Mr. Mitchell virtually every day when Mr. Mitchell was campaign director, and every day, therefore, would probably have had memoranda.
And I understand from your testimony that Mr. Magruder had a file called the Mitchell file in which he placed documents that related to matters he wished to discuss with Mr. Mitchell.
Yes, sir.
And according to your best recollection, the file containing some gemstone reports was what was in those papers on one occasion.
Yes, sir.
Now, you spoke about having the time Mr. Odell took out the blue file.
Yes, sir.
Which I understand contained gemstone information and other information.
Yes, sir.
Was this the kind of a file the gemstone file was in?
It was. I believe if that has my initials on it, it is the file that I gave to your staff in order to...
Yes, it has your initials on it, and dated May the 21st, 73.
Yes, sir. I gave it to your staff to indicate the kind of file it was.
Might let that be marked as appropriate as an exhibit and received in evidence as such. Now, did anyone else receive copies of the memos that Mr. Mitchell sent to Mr. Magruder sent to Mr. Mitchell?
Yes, sir. Each document that went to Mr. Mitchell through me, that would have been a formal document going to Mr. Mitchell, a duplicate copy was sent to Mr. Haldeman's office.
And Mr. Haldeman was the chief of staff in the White House.
That's correct. Just in fairness to the nature of what we were doing there, we were working for the president, who was the candidate, and therefore we were providing him the opportunity, if he wished, or if Mr. Haldeman wished, to see any documents that were taking place in his campaign.
You know whether you ever received, whether anyone on the committee to re-elect the president ever received any communications from Mr. Haldeman?
Yes, sir. I would imagine that a number of people, well, to be precise, Mr. Haldeman had working for him a man named Mr. Gordon Strawn. It was my impression that Mr. Strawn communicated frequently with many members in the committee. Mr. Haldeman himself may have communicated directly with other senior staff members. I don't imagine that it was frequent.
Would it be proper to describe it, Mr. Strong, as activities as something in the nature of a liaison between the committee to re-elect the president and Mr. Haldeman?
Yes, sir.
Have you had any conversations with Mr. Magruder since June the 17th?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, I have on a number of occasions. Do you mean conversations related to the concerns of your committee?
Yes.
I have, subsequent to June 17th, there took place a conversation in which I asked Mr. Magruder about some of the things which I've described previously. I think I asked him by way of raising some suspicion, just what was going on, and I think I asked him on that occasion what gemstone was, because I did not know what gemstone was, and he indicated to me that he didn't know what gemstone was either. Now, at that time I was asking him, are we involved in this thing? Are we connected to this thing? Because it looks a little suspicious, and he indicated to me that we were not. There was another conversation in which Mr. Magruder, I had volunteered to be helpful to another member of the committee, and it would have, I think, involved me getting involved in subsequent activities, and he indicated to me that I should not.
Did your conversation with Mr. Magruder, in which you asked Mr. Magruder what the gemstone file meant or was, did that occur after he had called from California and asked that it be removed from the committee headquarters over the weekend?
Yes, sir. The conversation I'm describing took place in his office. I think he may have initiated it by calling me into his office and saying, you know, how are things going, or something like that.
And after that, he told you he didn't know what the gemstone file was?
That's correct.
Well, he told you that, he told you and Mr. Odell that night when he called from California, it was very sensitive, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
And to please remove it from the office over the weekend?
Yes, he did.
How many times did Mr. Magruder meet with John Mitchell before John Mitchell became the campaign director?
Prior to March 1st, I can only speak of times between November and March when I knew Mr. Magruder. He met with him several times a week, I would say, on average. That's indicated in the notebook that I've described that Vicki Shern kept.
And that was while Mr. Mitchell was still Attorney General and
Yes,
had
sir.
Offices in the Justice Department?
Yes, sir. He went down to meet with Mr. Mitchell. That's right.
Now, how many times did Mr. Magruder meet with Mr. Mitchell after Mr. Mitchell resigned as ceased to be Attorney General and took up offices in the headquarters of the committee to re-elect the president?
I would say that Mr. Magruder, perhaps early in March, when Mr. Mitchell also was concerned with the hearings concerning ITT, it may not have had this frequency, but certainly with the exception of those days, it was my impression that Mr. Magruder met with Mr. Mitchell every day.
What was your first telephone call with Mr. Magruder on June the 19th, 1972?
On June the 19th, 1972, that was on the Monday morning when Mr. Magruder returned from California. I believe I just saw him when he came in and did not have an opportunity to talk to him.
Did Mr. Magruder have meetings from time to time with members of the White House staff?
Yes, sir.
How frequently?
I would say that he met with different members of the White House staff who were concerned with different aspects of the campaign practically every day. Certainly as the campaign heated up and became more active, he did. But that could that would have to be verified in that calendar. I can't speak precisely.
Where did those meetings take place?
It depended on the individual, sir. If it was a senior member of the White House staff, I would say that it probably took place at the White House or in the Executive Office Building. If it was a member, a more junior member of the staff, it probably took place in our offices.
Now, what senior members of the White House staff would Mr. Magruder meet with at the White House?
Well, now, here, to be precise, he did not meet that frequently. He probably talked on the phone more with senior members of the White House staff. I think that he met with virtually all of the senior members of the White House staff that were concerned with either political activities of one kind or another, or the campaign.
And who would those senior members be?
That would have been Mr. Colson, Mr. Dent, Mr. Ehrlichman, perhaps later after the campaign got going and the platform was important, Mr. Haldeman, perhaps. All of these men, of course, were extremely busy, and when Mr. Magruder went over there, I wasn't certain whether, in fact, he'd been able to see them or not. There were others.
Which members of the White House staff came down to the committee, the headquarters of the committee to re-elect the president, to see Mr. Magruder?
Well, it would have depended upon the subject of the meeting. If the meeting concerned something that one of them were directly involved in, for example, Mr. Timmons was the man who oversaw the convention. He would have come probably to the committee offices and met with Mr. Magruder and other people concerned with the convention. I would say that the more senior the member of the White House staff, the less likely he would have had time to come to the committee, and therefore they would have come less frequently.
Did Mr. Dean ever come to the committee to re-elect the president and consult Mr. Magruder?
Yes, he did, and he did not come that frequently. He came on several occasions that I saw him there.
Did you receive any instructions from Magruder about the shredding of documents after June 17th, 1972?
Well, yes, sir. I received instructions that related to documents that were later destroyed. What I received were instructions to look through the files and to try to centralize documents that were sensitive politically. The purpose, the instruction was not go find political things and shred them. The instruction was go find the sensitive political documents that we have in our files and bring them to me. And that's what I did. Some of those were subsequently destroyed because they appeared in his outbox and were marked destroy. Others I didn't see again.
What was the general nature?
Virtually anything. Well, I think that Mr. Magruder's secretary and I looked through his own files. I think other people at the committee did similar things, and virtually anything that concerned the opposition, contenders, that sort of thing, that would have been awkward or politically damaging to, no, even broader than that, anything that would have concerned the opposition.
Did I understand this? One of the files that you gave to Mr. Odell the time that Mr. Magruder called from California was a file relating to opposing, you said opposing contenders?
I believe it was, yes,
In other
sir.
words, that was data on Democratic candidates for Democratic nomination?
Well, to be specific, I gave Mr. Odell two files, one that was contained inside of another. One file is the file that's become known as the gemstone file, and I don't know what the contents were. I know from reading the newspaper now what I presume them to be. The other file was a file that concerned, it was called attack or attack strategy, and that concerned materials, that contained materials concerning the opposition, but I'm not certain of exactly what was there on the 17th.
Did you receive any documents from Mr. Liddy on June the 16th, 1972?
Yes, I did.
What were they?
I received an envelope that I believe is similar to the one that I identified as saying sensitive material on it. Mr. Liddy at that time gave me this envelope which was sealed and said to me, here's an extra or something like that. Magruder wanted a copy, Magruder wanted an extra. And that's the document that I received.
And you gave that to Mr. Magruder?
No, I didn't. Here's what happened. I put it in my file drawer, and that clearly would have fallen within the category, I presume, of documents similar to the ones that I've called the gemstone file. The reason that it would have is that it came in a similar envelope, and Liddy had called it a copy. On Monday morning, I discovered that I had not given that to Mr. Magruder, to Mr. Odle, as I had been instructed to do. It was a copy, I presumed, of the material I had given to Mr. Odle, and it was not with it. In fact, I guess I hadn't done what I was asked to do to get the sensitive material out of the office. At that point, I did not know Mr. Magruder was going to return that Monday morning. It turns out he was already in Washington. And thinking that it was a copy and sensitive material that should have been gotten out of the office, I destroyed it. Now, shortly thereafter, Mr. Magruder came into the office, and I realized that I could have turned it over to him. So I think it was a mistake on my part. I'm sure that he's learning for the first time about this.
Was that destroyed by shredding?
Yes, sir.
And that happened on June 19th?
Yes, sir.
When were you first interviewed by the prosecuting attorney, Mr. Silbert?
I met Mr. Silbert for the first time on April 8th of this year.
This year. And did you make a statement to him substantial to what you made to the committee today?
Oh, yes, sir. It was not on April 8th that I made this statement. As a matter of fact, I had completely forgotten that action. I mean, you're speaking of the shredding of that document or of the gemstone?
Well, just generally speaking.
Generally speaking, shredding that document I remembered for the first time when I read that Mr. Gray had shredded a document, and I suddenly realized that there was a similarity there.
When were you subpoenaed to go before the grand jury?
On April 8th. It was on a subsequent meeting with Mr. Silbert that I described that document to him. It was in a previous meeting. It was in the previous appearance before the grand jury that I described virtually all that I've described here today.
Now that was, did you talk to Mr. Silbert before you talked to this committee staff?
Yes, sir.
Were you subpoenaed before the grand jury before you talked to the staff of this committee?
Well, no, to be precise, on March 30th, your staff subpoenaed me, which was the first time that I'd heard from an investigatory body. I met with two of your investigators on that Friday. The subpoena was canceled. I believe, Mr. Chairman, you were out of town and returned, and the nature of the proceeding changed. Subsequently, I was subpoenaed by the grand jury and appeared there.
Now, did you receive a phone call or any communication, rather, from Mr. Magruder after you were subpoenaed to go before the grand jury or before our committee?
Yes, sir. On that Friday, which was, I believe, March 30th, actually, it was in the newspaper before I knew what was going to happen. I read in the newspaper that morning that I was to be subpoenaed.
And what did Mr. Magruder ask you to do in that
he asked me to get together with him. He called me at home that morning and asked me to get together with him that morning. He asked me whether he could take me to work. I indicated that I didn't think that was appropriate because I presumed that the reason I was being subpoenaed before this committee was to discuss Mr. Magruder, and therefore I didn't think it was appropriate for us to meet. He then called me again that morning to urge a meeting. I suggested there should be a third person there, and we set a meeting, and then I chose not to attend the meeting. I wanted to be firm about not meeting with him.
Did he say anything to you in either of those conversations about the meeting with Paul O'Brien?
Well, yes, sir. The nature of that was this, as I understand it, that I indicated to him that if we were going to meet, that there should be a third person there. And he said, well, we'll have to find someone. How about if we find either Paul O'Brien or Ken Parkinson, who were counsel to the committee? I said that that would be acceptable, but subsequently called Mr. O'Brien at 11 o'clock that morning and said that I didn't think it was appropriate to get together with the man about whom I was going to be asked to testify. Mr. O'Brien agreed with that and said that that seemed to be he understood completely and there was no problem.
Did Mr. O'Brien give you advice about or make an offer of help to you?
Mr. O'Brien?
Yes.
Well, yes, sir. He was counsel to the committee, and I think he said, I'll be glad to help you, Bob. But he said, you have to realize that if you have independent counsel or someone who's independent who can give you advice, that may be your the best situation. After all, I have to represent the committee as well. And
what was Magruder's reaction when you told him that
I didn't want to come to the meeting?
That you didn't want to come to the meeting?
Well, he called me from Mr. O'Brien's office expecting me to be there and found that I wasn't going to attend. And his response was extremely agitated, and he felt that he wanted to know what I thought I was doing. He also indicated to me that I had said to Mr. O'Brien I didn't think there was very much I could provide that would be helpful to this committee. And Mr. O'Brien had apparently, we just discussed briefly the nature of the evidence I could provide. And Mr. Magruder, one of the pieces of evidence, of course, was the easel. And we mentioned that, and I think Mr. Magruder stated that he said there was no easel. He said, I don't see how you can remember that.
Was that the third, he called you at your home, didn't he?
Yes, sir.
Talked about that. And that was the third phone call he made to you that day?
Yes, sir.
And I would like to explain your conversation. Well, what did he tell you, if anything, outside of the easel incident? What did he tell you?
What did he tell me?
Yes.
Well, he also indicated to me that, the nature of the conversation was one in which he was saying to me, now, what are you doing? There was no easel. And then he said, I can't understand this. He said, are you not going to be cooperative? Are you not going to, everyone else has been cooperative, or something to that effect. Now, in fairness to Mr. Magruder here, because I think it's bordering on a very serious point that I've discussed with your staff, there was a fourth phone call on that day. He, I think, knew that he didn't wish that I didn't want to meet with him. And he called my home and had my wife call me and ask me to call him that evening. Now, in that evening phone call, the entire nature of the phone call was different. I think he said that he was upset, that he was sorry if he was overly anxious, and he said he just wanted me to realize that there were some extremely serious matters concerned here, and that I should treat them in that way. And I said I intended to treat them in that way. And
did he tell you at that time that you should be careful about what you said because people's lives and futures were at stake?
Yes, he did. That was in that second phone call, and that was by way of explaining to me why he was so concerned.
Now, just for my edification, I wish you to explain about the easel story, because I don't quite understand it.
Yes, sir. Well, I think the nature of the easel story is just that Mr. Liddy came to me indicating that he was going to have a meeting with Mr. Mitchell, and that he wished to have some sort of a prop to use on which to use visual aids. And I indicated to him I would try to look for such a prop. I had, I think, one of the secretaries call Mr. Mitchell's office and see whether there was such a prop, and I don't think there was.
In other words, Mr. Liddy told you he was going to meet with Mr. Mitchell.
Yes, sir.
And he asked you to ask you if you could get him an easel on which he could display charts.
He didn't say charts, but that would be I presume that's what it was.
Sorry it took so long. I didn't understand.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. If there is no objection by you or the committee, I'd like to yield now to Senator Weicker to examine the witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Reisner, I'd like to go back to the evening of June the 17th, because as I understand your testimony, and as I also understand testimony that has been given before this committee, there seems to be some discrepancy as to what occurred. Now, just let me try to go over the sequence of events that were, or that transpired with the phone call to Mr. Magruder on the evening of the 17th from Mr. Magruder's office. Was Mr. Odle on the phone when you spoke to Mr. Magruder?
Yes.
During the entire time?
It's my belief that he was on the phone during the entire time. As I remember the phone call, he initiated it.
Now, may I stop? Mr. Odle initiated the phone call?
Yes, sir.
To Mr. Magruder?
Yes, sir.
Why would he have initiated it?
He, I think, came into the room and said, what is it that you're doing here? And I said, Jeb called me and asked me to come down here. He then said something to the effect of, well, let's call, well, he said, I said that the reason I was down there was to remove some sensitive things from the file, and that's what Jeb wanted me to do. And he said, do you know exactly what he wants? And I said, well, no, not really. And he said, well, I think we ought to tell him about the news or something to that effect. And so he called Mr. Magruder. When he placed that call, Senator, I had the impression that he had made several calls that day and that he was just staying in touch again.
And the call having been placed to Mr. Magruder, was it then Mr. Odle that led off the inquiry, or were you the first one to speak to Mr. Magruder? And was the nature of the question as to what was meant by sensitive material?
Well, as I recollect the thing, and there's a little bit of this is my best recollection. Mr. Odle began the conversation by describing the evening news and what had been shown on the evening news that night. The second thing that he discussed, I think, was security, that it seems to me that he must have said something like he had in fact doubled the guard and everything was okay, but he said, now, Bob tells me that there's some things you want to get out of the office, or, that there's some things here that you want to have us take home. Can I help, or something to that effect? And he said, what is it that you want? And that's where Mr. Magruder, I think, began describing precisely what it was that he wanted. And
did Mr. Magruder, that would be my next question, describe precisely what it was that was to be removed from his desk?
Okay, now, as to whether Mr. Magruder used the word gemstone to describe exactly what it was that he wanted removed, I don't know. It was my initial recollection that he probably did, because it's during that second phone call that I came to know exactly that file should be removed, among other things. He may not have, and I just don't know the answer to that.
Did Mr. Odle assist in the removal of material from Mr. Magruder's desk?
No, sir. It was left to me to determine which materials it was that Mr. Magruder had described to me in that phone call.
Now, the materials that were removed from Mr. Magruder's office by you and Mr. Odle, Mr. Odle said that he returned the file on Monday morning. Would that be correct?
Yes, he did. I've read his testimony. I believe that he did say that it was on Monday morning. My recollection of his returning that file was not that it was Monday morning, but, I don't...
Do you have any idea as to whether or not Mr. Odle would have known what was contained in the file which he took home?
No, I don't have any idea.
By the nature of the phone conversation?
No, I don't.
But that was the same phone conversation which indicated to you...
Which file it was, that's correct.
Which file it was...
But as to the substance...
But as to the contents...
No, sir. I don't have any... I don't have any knowledge of that.
All right. Do you know of any phone calls as between Mr. Magruder and Mr. Colson?
Yes, sir.
Concerning demonstration projects?
Okay. I've read that there was a story in the press recently...
I'm interested in your knowledge and not what you've read.
Okay. It's my impression that Mr. Colson was... Well, let me go back. I think I've described earlier in testimony here that at the time of Mr. Hoover's death, there was a demonstration. I think it was here on Capitol Hill. At that time, it seems to me, Mr. Magruder received a phone call in which he was instructed to get counter-demonstrators. Now, I wasn't monitoring the phone call. I was sitting in front of him when he received the phone call, and so I don't know exactly who it was. It was my impression that it was Mr. Colson that did that. Now, the reason that I say that is that I think I subsequently said, I expressed some surprise about the activity, and he indicated to me something along the lines of, it's a throwaway. We got to do things like this because that allows us to say no when it's important.
Now, were there any other projects aside from the counter-demonstration which you've referred to that were discussed as between Mr. Magruder and who you thought to be Mr. Colson?
Okay, and when I say thought to be, you know, it was my impression that it was from the circumstances. And if asked who I thought it was Mr. Colson, but I can't say that. It seems to me that Mr. Magruder also was called on a subsequent occasion. The reason I remember this is that he made some joke about the fact that he'd gotten himself in trouble. The way he'd gotten himself in trouble was that he had removed an individual who was supposed to be sitting in front of the White House wearing a McGovern button. He had said he'd called it off. He had placed that individual there initially, I guess, and then had removed him. And he received a phone call. Again, it was my impression, but impression is as close as I can come. He had gotten himself in trouble and therefore replaced that demonstrator.
Now, from the period June 19th, June 23rd, was there a general house cleaning of files and removal of so-called sensitive material from the committee to re-elect the president?
Well, as to whether other individuals at the committee removed material, I don't know. As to what material there was at the committee, I can't be certain, but I have testified here today that I was asked to go through Mr. Magruder's files and to centralize the sensitive political material. Anything sensitive material takes on an added meaning here. I don't mean that as gemstone material. There was no other as far as I know.
All right. Within your knowledge, do you know where the orders came from as to this house cleaning?
No, sir, I don't.
Prior to July the 1st of 1972, to whom were major committee policy memos distributed?
Prior to
July 1 of 72.
Well, the major policy memos would have gone to Mr. Mitchell for his decision.
All right. After July 1st, 1972, where did all major committee policy memos go to?
To Mr. Clark McGregor. Copies of them would have gone to Mr. Haldeman, and additional copies would have gone to interested people in that particular decision.
Did Mr. Strawn play a role in the dissemination of the material as to who it would go to?
Oh, yes. Now, subsequently, Mr. Strawn was the contact point at the White House, and therefore those memos that we were just discussing would have been sent to Mr. Strawn for Mr. Haldeman. That was the purpose of sending them to Mr. Strawn.
After July 1 of 72, insofar as your own observations are concerned, was Mr. Clark McGregor's role at the head of the committee to re-elect the president a real role, or was he a figurehead?
Well, this has to be colored by the fact that I became Clark McGregor's executive assistant.
I understand.
My impression was that it certainly was, that the...
Certainly was what?
A real role. Mm-hmm. That the activities of the Committee for the Re-election of the President increased as time went on. That the burden on the campaign director increased as the campaign went on. And therefore, the activities that Mr. McGregor performed may have been different than those that Mr. Mitchell performed because of his own talents and because of the fact that there was more to do.
Yeah, I've got to go in just 1 second. The running of the campaign from that point on, was this a dual affair insofar as Mr. Strawn's role and Mr. McGregor's role were concerned? How would you relate these two individuals?
Well, no, Mr. Haldeman and Mr. McGregor would both have been aware of decisions concerning the campaign. Mr. Haldeman was informed after July 1st, as he was prior to July 1st, on an information basis. The decisions were those of the campaign director.
And then lastly, did Mr. Magruder ever tell you what happened to the gemstone file after June the 17th?
Yes, in a conversation that I think I began to go into with the chairman, Mr. Magruder, during that conversation said to me, "It's gone." I was asking about gemstone and its meaning, and he said, you know, I don't know what it means either. Forget about it, though. It's gone. Don't worry about it. That was, I can only speculate as to what it's gone means.
I have no further questions at this time. We'll have to go to the vote and
Senator Enway.
turn it over to Senator.
Mr. Reisner, from your testimony, you have indicated that you did inspect some of the so-called gemstone files. You advised this committee that some of the files related to candidates, and I believe you told the staff that some of the files related to a presidential appointee and a member of Congress. Were they all of a political nature?
Let me be specific about that, Senator, as to what I indicated to the staff. I indicated to the staff that the first time that I saw the word gemstone was not in those materials that I have described as being the ones that I was asked to move on June 17th. There was an earlier occasion. The stationery was different. It seems to me that the memo said something like subject gemstone, and there were two such memos that I remember having been marked destroy or something like that, and were put in the outbox. And it was from those two memos that I gathered an impression of subject matter, but as to whether the means of obtaining that information was the same.
No, I'm not talking about the means, but the subject matter was all political, wasn't it?
Those two pieces of general campaign intelligence that I have testified to, yes, sir.
Do you recall seeing anything referring to foreign organizations or forein countries?
No, sir, I did not.
Or international intrigue or conspiracy?
Now this is, in order to be specific in answer to your question, I was asked by your staff whether I recognized other code names, and I believe that the word crystal was brought up in that connection. That sounds familiar. I don't know specifically that I did see the word crystal, but it has a familiar sound to it. It seems to me that I did see one or two other memos that concerned demonstrators, that concerned the kinds of things that I think Mr. McCord has testified about here before. But as to whether or not they related to gemstone or to crystal or anything like that, I cannot be specific because I don't remember.
You have testified that Mr. Sedan Chair received $1,000 a month. How long was he employed by your committee?
I don't know. I think that if Sedan Chair referred to one individual, it was my impression that that individual was receiving compensation for approximately 6 to 9 months.
6 to 9 months. Do you know who Mr. Sedan Chair is?
No, sir, I don't.
I thought you told the committee you had some idea as to his identity.
I'm sorry?
Didn't you tell the committee you had an idea of his identity?
No, sir. At no time have I indicated that. I have indicated that that I had some idea as to where he might have been located at one point in time, but that I think is as close as I can come as to identity.
You've indicated that you weren't quite certain of the nature of the gemstone file, and yet on June the 17th, when Mr. Magruder asked you to take those files home, you showed great reluctance to do so and had Mr. Odle take it back. Why were you so reluctant?
No, I think that the nature of the reluctance was the nature of the circumstances under which the conversation took place. I think that had it come the other way, had Mr. Magruder said in that phone conversation, you take that file home, I would have done so. I don't think I would have had any reason not to. There was some hesitation. I think it was because I didn't know where the file was at the time that he was saying to me on the phone, you have the file, don't you? And I was, in fact, I didn't know where it was, and I think I said, yeah, I can find the file.
And it's your testimony that you were not aware of the nature of the gemstone file?
Well, with this exception, that I had a circumstantial understanding of who it came from.
And you were not aware that...
Mr. Liddy, and therefore I had some general awareness.
You were not aware that the information gathered for the gemstone file had been done so illegally?
No, sir.
Besides Mr. Magruder, have you met with any other person who might have attempted to influence you in your presence here or before any investigating group?
No, sir. I did not meet with Mr. Magruder, and as I also indicated, I think he took back his, if that was intended influence, I think he apologized for it.
Did any other person call you with...
Yes, sir. I have received phone calls from other individuals who have business before this committee. Mr. Strawn called me. He did not ask me to... He did not try to influence me in any way. He just indicated he'd like to get together, and through counsel, I declined. I was also called by Mr. Porter, and he didn't attempt to influence me.
Mr. Porter was a full-time employee of the committee, wasn't he?
Yes, sir.
But was he on the payroll of some other organization?
Mr. Porter?
Yes.
Not to my knowledge.
Didn't you testify that someone, I thought it was Mr. Porter, was on a company payroll but working full-time?
No, sir. Mr. Magruder had a conversation with Mr. Porter standing in front of me early in the year, in which Mr. Magruder said something to the effect of, "We've found a company where we can have some individual who was working for Mr. Porter work for that company."
Was this common practice in the committee?
No, sir.
Now, you've discussed the so-called demonstrations at the Hoover funeral. What was the nature of the demonstration?
At the demonstrations at the Hoover funeral? I don't know. I know from reading newspaper accounts, and I can fill it in. I mean, I can fill in my own understanding of what took place. I think the significance of that phone call also is one that's derived. It didn't seem that significant at the time.
Thank you very much, sir.
Mr. Reisner, it's possible that the points I'm going to raise have been raised in my absence. As you noticed, the committee had a roll call vote to attend, and part of us left and part of us stayed in an effort to expedite the proceedings and hopefully to finish with your testimony today. So if the points I raise are repetitious, bear with me and we'll move through them as fast as we can. It's my understanding that you've met with the staff of this committee on 3 separate occasions.
4, sir. Yes, sir.
4 occasions. And in any event, the last occasion was at your request.
The 3rd occasion was, yes. I met yesterday with the committee just to go through the notebook and to be helped to try to clarify some issues.
I see. All right. But the 3rd occasion, then, was at your request.
As a matter of fact, Senator, it was directly in response to a statement I think you had made on that Friday of hearings. I think you described the nature of witnesses that you wanted to see and indicated that you didn't know the questions to ask sometimes. There also were, as Senator Weicker has indicated, some conflicts which I didn't feel were material conflicts, but which they were issues that I thought I should discuss with the staff.
Well, we appreciate that, and we appreciate your coming forward of your own volition to give additional testimony. The information I have from the staff memorandum here is that you had indicated, in fact, that you thought there were certain discrepancies that you'd like to clarify based on your understanding of the facts and the facts as described by Mr. Odle.
Yes, sir.
And that's the point I wanted to reach. Would you describe for me, then, the points where you thought additional clarification was required vis-a-vis the testimony of Mr. Odle?
Well, there may very well be points that are in your summary that I don't remember raising. It seemed to me that there were a few points of question at the time. Who had the key to open the desk?
Who did?
I had the key to open the desk.
Right.
I worked for Mr. Magruder. Who left the room, or did Mr. Odle leave the room? It seems to me he did, but after the phone call. When did the phone call take place? I placed it at shortly after 6:30 because when I arrived, the news was on. What was discussed in the conversation, we'd reviewed that, but I thought it was worth going over it again.
So, in effect, your tender of testimony, as evidenced in your request for the 3rd meeting with the staff, was to supplement the testimony of Mr. Odle rather than to contradict the testimony.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think there are any significant conflicts.
Well, I think you're to be commended for offering to come forward with that information, and I appreciate you clarifying that point. Mr. Reisner, do I understand that you did not interview with Mr. Porter or Mr. Magruder or Mr. O'Brien? Is that the burden of your testimony?
That I did not interview?
Yes.
You mean,
subsequent to the June 17th entry into the Watergate complex, to discuss the nature of the situation, your role in the investigation, or any other aspect material of this inquiry?
Not precisely. I've testified that I did have several conversations with Mr. Magruder subsequent to June 17th in which this subject came up.
Did you ever meet and talk with Mr. Magruder in Mr. O'Brien's office?
No. The only time I've been in Mr. O'Brien's office was this April. I did not meet with Mr. Magruder in Mr. O'Brien's office. I talked to him on the phone when he called me from Mr. O'Brien's office to express his displeasure at my not coming to the meeting. I met with Mr. O'Brien subsequently, in which I've described the nature of our conversation. It was just, sure, go ahead and meet with the staff.
For the record, would you say who Mr. O'Brien is?
I'm sorry, Mr. Paul O'Brien is a lawyer here in Washington who was employed by the Re-election Committee, and in that role was just providing advice, and the advice was you simply have to, if you want to have counsel, you should have your own counsel, keep your own counsel,
Did he advise you about what you should say to the staff or what you should testify?
He told me I should tell the truth. And that's...
Did he tell you anything else?
No, sir.
I understand that you mentioned a conversation with Mr. Magruder and an unidentified party on the other end of the telephone that you thought might be Mr. Colson.
I have testified that I was sitting in Mr. Magruder's office and listened to him receive a phone call that it was my impression it was from Mr. Colson.
Well, I apologize to you for not being present when you covered that testimony, but even acknowledging the repetition, would you tell me on what you based that conclusion?
It just seems to me that, I don't know. I had the impression that that particular phone call came from Mr. Colson. It seems to me that his secretary, who would have been sitting practically in the entrance to his office, might have said it's Mr. Colson or something like that.
I'm not trying to protect Mr. Colson. I'm simply trying to sharpen the identification to have some bearing on the quality of the identification. So you're speaking of Mr. Magruder's secretary?
Yes, sir. There are any number of ways in which I could have gained the impression that it was Mr. Colson.
Can you help me any further by identifying some of those?
It could have been, he could have said, he could have addressed him by name or something in the phone call. Subsequently, I do remember having a conversation about this kind of thing. Maybe it's important to bring up the nature of how I testified to that phone call in the staff. I think the staff was asking me about demonstrators, and they were saying, well, what would cash have been spent on? Do you have any knowledge of demonstrators? And I said, I only have knowledge of this one occasion, possibly this other one.
Is that the total of your information on the question of identifying Mr. Colson as the other end of the telephone conversation?
To the best of my recollection, it was just gained circumstantially from sitting in front of this man and gaining a feeling of who he was talking to on the phone.
I'm trying to be fair to both you and to Mr. Colson. It is your firm impression that that was Mr. Colson on the other end of the telephone, but you cannot supply additional information on which you base that judgment. Is that a fair restatement of your situation?
Yes, sir. Perhaps even less strongly. I think I indicated that it could have been Mr. Howard, Mr. Colson's assistant.
All right. Mr. Reisner, time's growing short, and we're going to have another roll call vote very shortly. As with other witnesses, I assume you're willing to return and give further testimony if that becomes necessary.
Certainly.
I would yield now, if I may, to Senator Gurney.
Mr. Reisner, who employed you at the Committee to Re-elect the President?
Who employed me? Who
Yeah.
offered me the job?
Yes.
Mr. Magruder did.
Were you recommended by anybody?
Yes, sir, I was. I was recommended by Mr. Fred Malik to Mr. Magruder.
And what was your job before that?
Prior to coming to the Committee for the Re-election of the President, I was at the Environmental Protection Agency
For how long?
for approximately 3 or 4 months. 4 months. I had graduated from school in June, had gone to work for the Environmental Protection Agency, and then had been recommended for this job and had gone over and accepted it.
EPA was your first job after school?
Yes, sir.
And what was your pay there?
My pay there?
Yes.
My pay was a GS-12 salary, which was $15,000.
And at the committee to re-elect?
Identical. The pay was a lateral pay.
One or two questions here that others have raised, but I would like a little more detail on. You mentioned that about the meeting of Mr. Magruder with Mitchell in March in Key Biscayne.
Yes, sir.
And upon his return, you were instructed to call Gordon Liddy and tell him that the project was approved.
I have testified to that. I've also, I think, indicated that I cannot be certain that it came following that meeting, but that I do remember such.
Did you have any idea what the project was?
No, sir, I did not.
Did you
In
have
fact,
any...
that led to some confusion in the phone call, and Mr. Liddy objected to the time limit, and I indicated to him I didn't know what he was talking about.
You mentioned some of the meetings here that you noted in your log between Magruder and Mitchell and Dean and Liddy. Did you ever know what those meetings were about?
No, sir, I did not.
Did Mr. Magruder ever discuss them with you?
No, he did not.
There is one notation here in the log. It's on the page before the one marked Thursday, March 30th. Do you have a log there?
Yes, I do.
Could you turn to that?
I'm afraid it's gotten out of order. On the 29th of March.
Well, it's the one
Wednesday.
prior to March 30th. It isn't marked any date on mine here. It just has 3 notations on it.
Yes, sir.
And up in the left-hand corner, there's a notation that I cannot decipher. What does that say?
I think it says Saddam Muskie peace.
Well, what does that mean?
Mr. Saddam was the general counsel. He was therefore concerned with the election law. To the best of my knowledge, what he would have been concerned with there would have been an advertisement or something like that, or a piece that Senator Muskie may have run that we would have... Mr. Saddam would have been concerned with that kind of thing, and I remember him being involved with advertising litigation, and I don't know whether that's it or not.
But you think it's an ad that the Muskie campaign was running? Is that what you said?
Well, I think that it's... I don't know. I would have to ask Mr. Saddam what it was, because I don't remember it exactly. The reason it appears in that column is it would have been I would have been responsible for following up and seeing whether or not he had done the brief or whatever it was that he was asked to do.
On the date of the log marked Monday, June 19, did you turn to that one?
Yes, sir.
There are some names, again, over on the left-hand side in the upper part. What are those names?
Okay. It's my impression that those names are Liddy, Dean, Shumway, Strawn, and the fact that there's an arrow next to them, I can only guess as to what it means. I think that would have meant that it was just a continuing activity. Those were people who came in to see Mr. Magruder. That column would have referred to Mr. Magruder's activities. And it's my impression that those people came in to see Mr. Magruder, not together, maybe that Monday morning.
Do you have any idea why they were there?
Why they were there? Well, as to Mr. Liddy and Mr. Dean, I can only speculate from what I've read in the newspaper recently. As to Mr. Shumway, he was the press person at the committee, and therefore I think would have been meeting with Mr. Magruder as to what to say to the press. As to Mr. Strawn, it was his role to stay in touch with the committee, I guess. I don't know.
Well, is it your feeling that they came in to discuss the Watergate break-in?
Well, I'm certain that that's what Mr. Magruder was concerned about that morning.
Did they seem agitated? Do you recall anything about their appearance, how long they were there?
Well, as to whether they seemed agitated,
yes.
I can't say that. That's, perhaps.
Do you recall how long they were there?
No, I don't. I think that they would have, it seems to me they came in individually, but I'm not certain. It probably took most of the morning, judging from the notation.
You mentioned the money that you helped Mr. Porter count. I don't recall that you ever said anything about where it came from. Do you know where it came from?
It was my impression that it was given to Mr. Porter by Mr. Sloan.
On one occasion or several occasions?
I don't know. In fact, I don't know. As I tried to indicate, I don't know whether the money that was all the money that Mr. Sloan gave Mr. Porter was accounted for. The accounting was an accurate accounting, to the best of my knowledge.
Do you know who had gemstone files other than your boss, Mr. Magruder?
No, sir.
He never discussed that with you?
No, sir.
You mentioned that on some occasions when you, I guess, saw the file, or also the copies of these photos that apparently came from the Democrat National Committee, that it was indicated to you that you shouldn't be looking at those. Wasn't that your testimony?
Yes, sir.
Well, now, how is that indicated?
Well, I don't remember. The reason I say indicated is I do not remember Mr. Magruder specifically saying to me, don't look at this. But it seemed to me that he may have turned them upside down, and he may have indicated with his expression that it was none of my business. There were other times during the time that I worked for him that he was working on something and I didn't know what it was, and he indicated to me that it was none of my concern.
Well, that was going to be my next question. How many times did this occur?
Well, there were a number of times in which things were extremely closely held. Senator, at the time that the convention was moved, for example, at the time that new polling came in with head-on-head results with the president and contenders, that was information which was not given to me and in which it was made extremely specific that I was not to be involved in it.
Well, did you get the impression that there was, we'll call it, surreptitious activities going on
Yes, sir.
that you weren't supposed to know about?
Yes, sir.
And this occurred rather frequently, is that right?
No, I would have considered that prior to June 17th, when it clearly had an extraordinary impact on the campaign, I would have considered it to be very unimportant, that there were other things at the campaign that were important to the campaign.
Did Mr. Liddy spend a great deal of time with Mr. Magruder?
No, he would have met with him on several occasions, but not a great deal of time.
Did anybody from the White House contact you at any time after June 17th and counsel you about any testimony you might be giving?
No, sir. I was never contacted by anybody in the committee or at the White House.
There were FBI interviews, as I understand, of many of the committee to re-elect, personnel of the committee to re-elect the president after June 17th. Were you interviewed by the FBI?
No, sir, I wasn't.
Are you aware of such interviews?
Oh, yes. There would sometimes be 10, 15 FBI agents that would come to the office simultaneously.
There have been charges made by some that the committee to re-elect the president did not cooperate with the FBI. Can you shed any light on that?
No, sir. I think that there has been a news story saying that some of the agents may have resented the presence of counsel in those interviews. I was aware that there was counsel sitting in on interviews, but as to anything else, I'm not aware of anything else there.
Then it would be your recollection that there was cooperation.
Well, there was an extraordinary number of interviews. That was my impression, but I don't know anything more than that.
You mentioned reports and memos that went to the White House from your office. Did Mr. Magruder report directly at all to anybody in the White House?
Well,
regularly?
Concerning certain activities that took place in the campaign, there were individuals at the White House who were primarily concerned with those. and Mr. Magruder would have unquestionably discussed things with those people just because they were the ones who were responsible for them. As to whether he reported to them, Mr. Magruder worked for Mr. Mitchell and Mr. McGregor. The reporting relationship was one of coordination rather than reporting.
You mentioned the phone call in some detail that you had with Mr. Magruder on June 17th. Did you have any other phone calls with anybody in California?
No,
on
sir.
that date?
No,
That's
sir.
the only one.
That's right.
That's all, Mr. Chairman. I have to vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
With that, Florida's Republican Senator Edward Gurney has completed his questioning of Robert Reisner. The other committee members will also have questions about how the committee to re-elect the president operated and who reported to whom. And public television's continuous coverage of the Watergate hearings will continue after this pause for station identification.
Unabridged coverage of these hearings is provided as a public service by the member stations of PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service. Continues its coverage of hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Here again, correspondent Jim Lehrer.
We now return to the hearings as New Mexico Senator Joseph Montoya begins his questioning of Robert Reisner. During these questions, the committee members were leaving the room for a floor vote, and as a result, there was some overlap in questions because of the absences.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to apologize for not being here during the full course of the testimony, but we did have 2 roll call votes, and I had to be at 2 other meetings. Mr. Reisner, as administrative assistant to Mr. Jeb Magruder, you, of course, knew who he was going to meet every day while you were there. Is that correct?
I would say approximately, yes, sir.
And prior to March 4th, how many meetings did he have at the Department of Justice with Mr. Mitchell?
Prior to March 4th?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say that he met several times a week with Mr. Mitchell. That could be verified exactly in the calendar.
And what individuals accompanied him to see Mr. Mitchell at the Department of Justice during this time?
It would have depended on the nature of the meeting. If the meeting concerned advertising, for example, I'm certain that Mr. Peter Daly would have accompanied him.
Well, if the meeting was concerned with clandestine activities, who would accompany him?
Clandestine activities?
Yes.
Well, this is retrospective in the sense that I think I knew that there were activities that weren't.
Yes. Now that the names have been divulged, were any of those names connected with clandestine activities? Were there any of those individuals at the Department of Justice with Mr. Magruder during any of these times?
Well, I've testified that Mr. Liddy and Mr. Magruder went to the Department of Justice. Other individuals, I'm not certain.
What about Mr. Dean?
Yes, in the notebook, in the calendar, it indicates that Mr. Dean attended that meeting.
On how many occasions would you say Mr. Liddy accompanied Mr. Magruder to see Mr. Mitchell?
As far as I know, there was only one occasion, but perhaps the calendar shows more than that.
Now, prior to June the 17th, were you aware, or did you have any knowledge of any plans to bug the DNC or
No,
the
sir.
McGovern headquarters?
No, sir.
Did you have any inkling that such a thing might be in the offing?
No, sir.
You did not ascertain this until after the matter was announced in the newspapers?
That's correct.
Is that about right?
That's correct.
Now, were you aware, as AA to Mr. Magruder, were you aware of his activities with regard to employing individuals to disrupt any part of the Democratic campaign?
To Mr. Magruder's activities to employ individuals to disrupt the campaign, I cannot say that I was. There are individual incidents to which I've testified. For example, this Hoover funeral testimony that I've discussed here today, where I overheard a phone call which indicates that it was related to an activity. I did not have any knowledge of any of that kind of activity except circumstantially.
Well, were you aware that of the instance where
somebody from the CRP employed someone to park right in front of the White House and pose as a McGovern supporter?
Yes, sir.
Were you aware of other similar incidents?
Yes, sir. There's a distinction here which may not be a good one. The distinction is that it seemed to me at the time that the purpose of that individual sitting in front of the White House, and I learned about the individual after he had been removed and then was replaced there, that the purpose of that was some sort of a public relations effort, that it was for the publicity value of it, not for any disruptive value. Now, I'm not certain that that's a very...
Publicity for who?
Well, it was negative publicity for Senator McGovern would be the concept, and if that negative publicity is disruptive, then yes, sir.
You were aware of other instances?
Of individuals like that? Well, yes. I mean, I've testified that I was aware of an individual who I think was referred to, who was referred to as sedan chair, and that individual was obtaining information, it seemed, from the Humphrey campaign. Now, as to whether that individual worked for Mr. Humphrey and was disgruntled at that moment and passed information out, I can't say. I mean, it could have been less negative.
Well, were you aware that there was a plan being executed to employ individuals to pose as McGovern supporters at the Democratic National Convention and to indulge in certain acts, and that all this was under the sponsorship of the CRP?
Let me be specific about this, because just a minute ago when I said that I was aware of that individual, what I was aware of was the purported fruits of his activity. That's how I learned about the individual. Now, as to a plan to employ someone there, I listened to a conversation in which Mr. Liddy basically burst into Mr. Magruder's office and said, "I have this idea." Now, I don't know whether that, and the idea was to employ supporters who would pose as McGovern support. I presume it was McGovern supporters.
At the Democratic National Convention?
At the Democratic National Convention.
Tell us more about that conversation.
Well, the nature of the conversation was Mr. Liddy coming in and saying, "I have this great idea," and the idea included I think employing some sort of demonstrators who would wear McGovern identification badges.
And what kind of demonstrators would they be?
Well, I think that there was on one occasion, Senator, and I think I've described this to your staff, a woman who would have disrobed at the Democratic National Convention. Mm-hmm. That was the nature of the conversation. Now, that's important to point out, because I have no idea whether Mr. Magruder would have said that was a good idea or not. He certainly did not indicate that it was a good idea at the time. He just was amazed.
Well, he wasn't shocked.
I'm not.
Mr. Reisner, are you aware of any other plans along these same lines with respect to the conduct of the Democratic National Convention in Miami?
No, sir.
Now, do you know whether or not Mr. Magruder employed any of the individuals that were engaged in bugging or trying to disrupt campaign activities on the part of the Democrats?
No, sir. The most accurate, the most information I've ever seen about that has been in the newspapers recently.
Did you know Mr. Segretti?
No, sir.
Do you know whether or not he visited the CRP headquarters?
I don't know. I wouldn't have recognized him.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you kept a log, did this particular log, which you presented to the committee, reflect all the appointments that Mr. Magruder had, or can you tell us what other individuals at the White House Mr. Magruder met with?
Well, sir, to my knowledge, the calendar diary that was kept by my secretary would reflect his schedule accurately, and all individuals that he met with, unless he would have just stopped by their office to see them, would be reflected in that calendar.
Did Mr. Magruder meet very frequently with Mr. Liddy in his office or in Mr. Liddy's office?
I don't know about Mr. Liddy's office. I don't imagine that he did. It seems to me that he probably met with Mr. Liddy on a number of occasions, but not frequently. Their relationship was not one of, they did not get along very well.
Mm-hmm. Now, on the evening when you and Mr. Odle decided to take out some secret files from Mr. Magruder's desk, it is my understanding, as has been testified here too previously, that you took what was known as the advertising file and that you turned over what has been called the strategy file to Mr. Odle to take home with him. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, I took home some things in addition to that.
What else did you take?
I took home the first thing that I remember taking out of Mr. Magruder's desk was a document which was the June wave of polling information. There was a wave of polls that was conducted in late spring, and that was the most sensitive polling information we had. There was some analysis of that polling information. There was also a file, a large, thick file, that contained the operating plans and the key states that we considered important following, beginning in July. In addition to that, there was this advertising file. In fact, what that was not our advertising file concerning the November group and the Committee for the Re-Election of the President advertising. That file concerned the creation of the Democrats for Nixon, and it was therefore, which had not at that time been created. Mr. Conley had not returned from his trip, and it was very sensitive at that time.
Why was it sensitive?
Well, I don't think it was agreed to at that time that Mr. Conley would head the Democrats for Nixon. In addition to that, I know that there were a number of Democrats all over the country who might or might not wish to be supporters of the president.
Well, was the advertising file such that it contained advertising or plans for advertising, something derogatory against Democratic candidates?
No, I believe that all it contained at that time was the Democrats for Nixon did later conduct such negative advertising. I mean, it was shown on national television, but at that time, all that file contained, to my knowledge, was the ad copy for the ad which was going to represent the formation of the Democrats for Nixon.
Now, up to that time, you did know what was in the gem file, or you knew that there was something very strategic in the gem file?
Yes, sir. All I knew was that Mr. Magruder considered it important.
Why did you, as administrative assistant to Mr. Magruder, give the gem file then to Mr. Odle to take home when it was the only really sensitive file in the whole bunch?
Well, it's sensitive in retrospect. It's sensitive in the fact that we now know that it appears to have concerned illegal activities. If that was ordinary intelligence, just things that Mr. Liddy had been gathering somehow through his sources or whatever, in a perfectly legal way, it would have been sensitive, but it wouldn't have been any more sensitive than anything else that was taken home. I gave it to Mr. Odle because I was told to give it to Mr. Odle, and my relationship with Mr. Odle and his with Mr. Magruder was, one of trust. There was no reason not to give it to him. I was just asked to. I'm certain I would have taken it home if Mr. Magruder had said it the other way.
Well, did you on that day do any shredding?
No, sir.
Did you in any subsequent day do any shredding?
Yes, sir.
Tell us about that.
Subsequently, on Monday morning, as I've indicated, on Friday I had been given a document which, and I presume it was a document, I'd been given an envelope which was marked sensitive material, and when I was given that envelope...
Who gave you that?
By Mr. Liddy. When I was given that envelope by Mr. Liddy, he indicated to me that it was a copy or an extra, and it was standard operating procedure for me to get rid of copies. There were 5 copies made of all the documents that were given to Mr. Mitchell, and Clearly, that wasn't necessary for the files. Many of them were sensitive, and I would get rid of them. Now, on that Monday morning, following the 17th, I discovered that I had not, in fact, taken home that copy. I had not given that copy to Mr. Odle as I'd been instructed to.
Well, I understood that from your testimony, but the point I'm trying to make is, did you shred many documents after June 17th?
Oh, no, not many. It's conceivable that Mr. Magruder might have put something in his outbox and said, destroy, just written destroy on the thing, or I don't know, shred or something.
Did you on your own
Go
in and examine files, cull out sensitive documents, and shred them?
There's a distinction, and the distinction is if it had been an original, it is extremely unlikely that I would have destroyed something that was an original without having Magruder indicate that he didn't need it anymore.
Well, did you have any
If there was a copy, I'm certain that I've destroyed many copies.
Well, after June the 17th, did you receive any instructions, and pursuant to those instructions, if you did receive them, proceed to categorize documents as sensitive or confidential, and then proceed to shred them?
No, sir. The instructions were find those sensitive materials that may be in the files and give them to me, which is what I did.
And I think you indicated in your previous testimony that you wanted to centralize the sensitive documents in one particular file. That you did too, didn't you?
What I did was I culled the files to find things that were sensitive and gave them to Mr. Magruder. It's conceivable that he put them all in one file. It's conceivable he may have given them back to me, and they may have... I don't think so. I think it was a pretty random selection of materials.
Now, you mentioned the easel a few minutes ago, and what about the charts that were in Mr. Liddy's or Mr. Hunt's room, which were going to be used at the Attorney General's office? Did you see those charts?
No, sir. I did not see anything that I could identify as charts. I saw a package at approximately the same time. The size and shape of the package was such that it could easily have contained charts, but it might not have.
Well, was that package taken on that February the 4th visit to the Attorney General's office?
I didn't see Mr. Liddy leave for that meeting, and I don't know.
That is all, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witness.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just to complete the record, I have one brief question. Mr. Reisner, you've testified that from July to November 1971 you were employed by the EPA for $15,000.
No, sir. That was my annual salary.
$15,000, yes. And from there, from November 71 to July 72, as administrative assistant to Mr. Magruder, also at $15,000 per annum.
That was my initial salary when I joined the committee. I joined laterally. I was subsequently given a raise, I think it was in March of that year.
Then from July 1972 to November 1972, you were executive assistant to Mr. McGregor.
Yes, sir.
And what was your pay then?
It was $19,000. The initial raise was a $3,000 raise, which I think generally equalized my salary with those of other administrative assistants and people in similar positions at the committee, and I think that's in the GAO reports. I was subsequently, when moved to Mr. McGregor's office, given a raise of $1,000 to $19,000. That's also in the GAO reports.
Then from November 1972 to April 1973, you became a staff assistant to the President of the United States.
Yes, sir.
What was your pay then?
It was exactly the same as it was when I'd worked for Mr. McGregor. It was $19,000.
And from April 1973 to this date, you have been employed by the Office of Management and Budget.
Yes, sir.
And what is your pay there?
Okay. At the time that I was employed by the White House, I was on what they call the administrative role. That means that when the pay increase took place in January, it didn't affect me. Therefore, when I was offered this new job, the offer was made, and it would have been a one-grade increase over what would have been a GS-13 salary to a GS-14 salary, which is what I am now at the Office of Management and Budget. That's $23,000 something, $400.
$23,000.
I think it's $400. That's right.
Thank you very much, sir.
23,400.
Yes. I have this one question. When Mr. Magruder called you on one of the occasions on March the 30th after you'd been subpoenaed to go for the grand jury, he, in effect, suggested to you that you ought not to testify about the request of Mr. Liddy that you procure him an easel to show these visual exhibits to Mr. Mitchell, because he said that was incredible.
No, sir. Yes. I mean, in substance, yes. What he was saying was, he said, it's incredible. What do you mean that you remember the easel? Nobody remembers the easel.
Yeah.
And then later he said that he apologized, that he was under a great deal of pressure, and that he didn't mean that, and that I should do what I had to do.
Well, you construed that as advice on his part not to testify about that, didn't you?
I construed it as advice on his part at that time, that he thought it would be, he was indicating to me that it would be extremely unfortunate testimony, but he subsequently corrected that impression. And
Mr. Reisner, I just want to come back to one point on the questioning that I conducted earlier. You indicated that you thought Mr. Clark McGregor's role as head of the committee to re-elect the president to be a very real one, and you made that observation since you were his administrative assistant.
Well, I was just trying to, you asked me the question, I was trying to indicate my bias as a witness. I think that one of the things that Mr. McGregor did that simply didn't happen before was he traveled and he spoke.
Right.
And therefore the role changed.
Right. In other words, in that respect, he took a very active part
Absolutely.
With the committee to re-elect the president. Now, answer me this question. Did you tell Mr. McGregor everything that you've told this committee?
No, sir.
As to what transpired before he came over there?
No, sir, I didn't. Frankly, I've thought about that a good deal, as to whether Mr. McGregor, I mean, at that time, and I think throughout the summer, throughout the time after that, I had suspicions about the things that I've told this committee. It's not until Mrs. Harmony indicated that she typed the transcripts and that they came from Mr. Liddy and that Mr. Liddy had been convicted, I mean, that these things all lock up together and the testimony became significant. At that time, it would have been a matter of voicing my suspicions to Mr. McGregor, and I didn't do that.
Well, now, did anybody else voice any suspicions to Mr. McGregor?
Oh, absolutely. That I think is important to point out why I didn't do it.
The reason why I asked this question, you're, of course, well aware of the fact that during the course of the summer, on more than one occasion, Mr. McGregor indicated that there was nothing improper that had happened here.
That's right.
Now, did this give you any pause for concern while you saw these denials taking place? And
absolutely. I think that, but I think that it's, to be precise, I was in a situation where I thought that, I mean, I could make assumptions and say, I was asked to remove a file which had come from Liddy, and that Liddy was being investigated by the grand jury. It looks very suspicious, and I certainly had suspicions about that. On the other hand, I had been reassured by Mr. Magruder that there was not an involvement here, that the committee was not involved. You know, I listened to Mr. McGregor ask Mr. Magruder those same questions. In Miami at the convention, we spent 4 hours and I listened to that discussion. There wasn't any need for me to raise to him suspicions. I'm sure that he had them himself. But as to evidence, I don't think at any time did I have anything more conclusive.
But did you have a concern that possibly he might be standing before the press and the nation and making these disavowals without complete knowledge? Did that give you any pause for concern?
Yes, it did. On the other hand, I didn't have complete knowledge. There was no question in my mind that Mr. McGregor was discussing this with people who knew the facts. And the idea that perhaps Mr. McGregor was being misled by others with whom he was working, that concerned me a good deal, yes.
Concern you in what way?
Well, for exactly the reason that I think you've indicated, that to watch a man stand up before the country and say there is no involvement here, when you yourself think to yourself, well, maybe there isn't and maybe there is. But you know, there are so many factors involved in this thing that I wasn't aware of and that I wasn't sure about. I think that, you know, I didn't know what the factors were. I mean, for me to go to Mr. McGregor and say, you know, I have these suspicions, that would have indicated, I think, that I had complete lack of faith in what I'd been told by Mr. Magruder, and I didn't. I trusted him.
You had no cause to believe at that time, in other words, that there was something that had gone wrong?
Well, no, I had cause to believe that there was something that had gone wrong, but as to what it was that had gone wrong, whether Mr. Liddy had acted on his own, I had no cause, I had no evidence to believe that he had not acted on his own.
In any event, neither you nor any other member of the committee to re-elect the president gave Mr. McGregor a briefing.
Oh, no, that's not, that's why I was indicating that he was talking to, I mean, he talked to Mr. Magruder, he talked to Mr. LaRue, he talked to Mr. Mitchell, he talked to Mr., I'm certain, he attended the 8:15 meetings at the White House, and so I'm certain that he talked to Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Colson and Mr. Ehrlichman. And
but to your own knowledge,
yes, sir,
none of the information which involved you personally was ever transmitted by you to Mr. McGregor. Is that correct?
Of my knowledge, no. I don't know whether this information that I've talked about here today was transmitted to Mr. McGregor. No.
And so that when you saw the disavowals take place, it did concern you that such disavowals were being made without this type of knowledge, well, specifically the knowledge that you had, to remind anybody else.
Let's be specific about the knowledge. The knowledge was that I'd been asked to remove and to give to Mr. Odle a file which seems suspicious in retrospect because I think that it came from Mr. Liddy. As to whether Mr. McGregor knew that I'd been asked about that, no. But then, I mean, there are a lot of other factors concerning that file that would have been even more important than the little bit that I knew about it, such as the content.
I have no questions, Mr. Chairman.
Just one question, Mr. Reisner. You answered Mr. Senator Ervin's question about the attack file that you saw on June 17th. You had seen that attack file on prior occasions, had you not?
Yes, I had. It was an active file, and I think what I meant to say was that I wasn't certain what was in the file on June 17th. I have a general knowledge of what would have been in it.
But you had seen documents in that file on prior occasions, isn't that correct?
Yes, I'm not certain that I've seen all of the documents that were in that file.
Had you seen documents on prior occasions that began a confidential source reports or a reliable source reports?
I had. I've read in the press that is supposed to have significance in that it's supposed to indicate a wiretap transmittal. I didn't know that at the time, and if in fact that's what it contained. I don't believe that it did, but I had seen documents that began a confidential source reports.
Thank you.
I'd like to have the diary marked or done for this.
I think Mr. Reisner has that still in front of him. If we could get that marked as an exhibit. I think it's 17.
We would like to have that, retain that as an exhibit if it's satisfactory to you. Mark whatever the appropriate number is, and they'd be marked as exhibit and received as such. On behalf of the committee, I want to take this occasion to thank you for the complete cooperation which you have given to the committee at all times, and to commend you on the forthrightness of the testimony you've given to the committee today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The committee will stand in recess till 10 o'clock tomorrow.
In today's hearings, we have heard from two more lower-level campaign people who had access to key Watergate documents but failed to examine them, simply because they were told not to. One thing has become clear. The Republicans had no need to worry about campaign security within their organization. We have heard today of code words, of Sedan Chair 2, the spy within the Humphrey camp, and there was Ruby 1, Ruby 2, and Crystal, who were furnishing material for the Gemstone intelligence logs that included overheard Democratic telephone calls. Tomorrow, we should be getting quite a different perspective. The witness will be Hugh Sloan, who quit the campaign soon after Watergate. And it's been widely reported that he left because he was invited to participate in the cover-up, but decided he couldn't in good conscience. Sloan has been moved up on the witness list as part of a plan explained by Committee Counsel Sam Dash to skip further detail on the break-in itself and concentrate on the aftermath. He talked with Impact's Peter Kay.
Mr. Dash, the testimony today led toward Jeb Stuart Magruder, just as surely as the testimony 2 weeks ago led toward John Dean. When are we going to see those two gentlemen before the committee?
Well, it's our expectation, everything going well, to have Mr. Magruder and Mr. Dean next week. In fact, we are expecting to call Mr. Magruder next Tuesday.
Well, these are the first of the so-called big boys that will appear. When can we expect to see the rest of them? Mr. Haldeman, Mr. Ehrlichman, Mr. Stans, Mr. Mitchell, and the rest of them?
Well, I would say certainly by the 3rd or last week in June, all of those witnesses will be heard from.
I've heard several reports or speculations from committee members and others that the hearings will be over by August 1st. Is that a fair supposition?
It's possible even sooner, but it would take sometime in July and when we will complete our hearings. Now, when I say hearings, the hearings of this phase, which is the Watergate phase, which includes the cover-up of the Watergate phase. Of course, our committee is mandated by its resolution to go into the areas of political espionage and campaign contributions. And we are investigating that now. We'll have a heavy summer of investigation, and we will have hearings in the fall in that phase.
Now, what's your next phase after you get through with the committee to re-elect the president? What will you get into next?
Well, the next major phase is the cover-up and the obstruction of justice, which I think our committee and most people believe is much more significant and important than the break-in itself.
Samuel Dash, law professor on leave to Senator Ervin's committee, the man who, with Ervin's backing, has more than any other set the course of this investigation and its tone. Despite demands from some committee members that the big boys, the Ehrlichmans, the Haldemans, and the Deans, should be heard from before the public interest wanes, Dash has persisted, has with Ervin insisted that a proper foundation, as lawyers call it, be laid for the testimony of each witness. It may at times be tedious, Dash reasons, but it is his way of building a case.
Two gentlemen with a special knowledge of congressional investigations and the many legal ramifications involved watched today's hearing session with us. They are Alan Barth, an author-journalist here in Washington, a man who wrote a book about congressional investigations. He was joined by Dean Adrian Fisher of the Georgetown University Law School here in Washington. Gentlemen, the committee itself was on trial to some degree when they began today as a result of their decision not to delay their proceedings after being asked to do so by Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor. How do you think the committee handled itself today? Dean Fisher?
I think it handled itself quite well. First, I think its decision to go ahead with the hearings was wise because a 3 months delay wasn't what the issue was about. 3 months from now, the cause for calling off hearings, if anything, would be stronger. Mm-hmm. And that meant you get into indictments, you then get into trials, get into appeals. It meant really calling this aspect of it off for good. Now, I think the hearing today, by its methodical, I think, is probably our painstaking way of developing evidence, I think went out of its way to avoid any Roman holiday type atmosphere, which might well have jeopardized the rights of defense of any persons that may later be indicted as a result of this.
Alan, how do you feel about it?
I share Dean Fisher's view. I was impressed, as I have been in the past, with the day's performance. I was taken particularly with the decision of the committee not to force Mr. Liddy to come before it and plead publicly the privilege against self-incrimination, which he's pleaded in private. That seems to me to be wise and right and respectful of a constitutional right. One of the ugly aspects of some past congressional investigating committees has been the practice of determining in executive session that a witness would plead the Fifth Amendment and then putting him, as it were, on exhibition before television cameras by forcing him in public over and over again to refuse to defend himself. punishing him, as it were, by exposure and by publicity. That is not a proper role for a congressional committee. And this committee, I think, has given a very good illustration of respect for the rights of witnesses called before it.
Did Dean Fisher, did you agree with the, or did you notice also that the committee was asking both witnesses, when was it that you were first interviewed by the FBI? When was it you were first interviewed by the U.S. attorneys? When was it you were first interviewed by the congressional committee, by their committee? They seeming to build the case that that the Senate committee got there before the Justice Department in many cases, that they're trying to build their own justification or to show that they got there first, and why in the world should they quit before somebody else does? Do you think that?
Well, I think they were making that point, and particularly with the second witness, they had a pretty good point. They did get there first.
Well, on Reisner.
On Reisner, yes. And it just seems to me that is making another point. The committee sort of says, look, well, the government has had this executive branch almost a year now, and they really weren't making that active progress towards any than the original Watergate 7 until the mutterings and rumblings came, and the Hill was largely responsible for it. So I think, this isn't the first time that activities on Capitol Hill have jarred things loose in the prosecution. It's a long time ago, but the Teapot Dome had elements of that in it, too. They had both a congressional investigation and a prosecution proceeding in parallel. So I think they made a good point.
Was in those other cases where there was parallel investigations going, was anybody later acquitted or a conviction thrown out of court as a result of something that happened at a congressional hearing?
Well, there have been, as we mentioned today, in the Delaney case up in Boston, First Circuit in '52, a income tax collector got off a prosecution because of a congressional committee contemporaneously was conducting what was sort of a Roman holiday. Mm-hmm. It doesn't automatically follow. It depends what the committee does and how it handles itself.
Alan, don't you agree that if there was an inclination, and I'm not saying there was, but if in fact there was an inclination on the part of any member of this committee to kind of go the Roman holiday route somewhere along the way, that the whole business of Cox has now tempered that? I mean, these committee members are now on the spot, are they not? They better play it cool and all that.
On the spot or not, they certainly seem to be quite determined to give a display of bipartisanship or non-partisanship of an appropriate concern of a committee entrusted with inquiry by the Senate itself to carry out that responsibility with dignity, with great decorum, with deliberation, and with a respect for the people called before it.
Well, that's all. What I was suggesting, that if all you say is true, but that if they had any tendency not to be that way, that now under the gun as a result of being challenged by Archibald Cox and saying that if they continue, they will endanger the judicial process in the future, that they will be even more careful than they would have otherwise been. Would that not?
Yes, that's quite true, and I think you were right a moment ago when you said that the committee was itself, in a sense, on trial. So far, I think it's been coming through that trial really rather remarkably well. And if Archibald Cox contributed to that, so much the better. I think he was making a record that it was appropriate for him to ask the committee to suspend or defer its inquiry, but I think it was absolutely right for the committee to insist that it had a vital function to perform at the command of the Senate and to go ahead with its business in an orderly, methodical, careful way.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Today, the Senate Watergate investigators took a couple of seemingly low-key steps in their move to lay the Watergate case end to end in public view. Tomorrow, there will be more background building with the testimony of Hugh Sloan, former treasurer of the committee to re-elect the president. Some feel it is a tedious process, the slow accumulation of information and personalities and nuances, under the public challenge that these proceedings will jeopardize the process of justice as it relates to Watergate. The pace is expected to be even more careful tomorrow and the other tomorrows of the public hearings. But there are dramatic human aspects of the Watergate hearings that should not be ignored by any of us. Sally Harmony and Robert Reisner are real people who until today none of us had ever really heard of. Were they believable in their testimony? What kind of hard decisions did they have to make? Did they do anything wrong? What would we have done if we had been in their place at their time? Watergate is definitely a story of facts at this point, no question about that. But it's also a story of people. And tomorrow the people's name is Hugh Sloan, another new famous name in America, as of tomorrow. All right, at this point we'd like to thank all of you who have made comments on our primetime coverage of these hearings. The response has been overwhelming, and we're grateful to those of you who have taken the time to write. We'd like to encourage you folks who still wanted to express an opinion to drop a line to your local public television station, the one you're watching right now, as a matter of fact. They're the ones who decided to run these broadcasts, and they depend on you to keep them in business and on the air. And until tomorrow night, and on their behalf, I'm Jim Lara for Robert McNeil and Peter Kay. Thank you and good night for Impact.
From Washington, you've been watching gavel-to-gavel videotape coverage of hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. This coverage is made possible by grants for special events coverage from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Ford Foundation, and has been a production of NPACT, a division of the Greater Washington Educational Telecommunications Association.